It's recording now, so you should see. Yeah.
Okay. Welcome to our panel, Aesthetic Responses to Environmental Emergencies, Creating New Forms of Collaborative Art and Media Practices. Hold on. And it's the conference stream, Migrant Eco-Criticism, and the panelists are listed below, and we have everyone's bio in the chat. To begin, I would like to direct your attention to the map of Central California coast as a way to recognize the land from which I'm speaking from in Berkeley, California, and the way every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the late 19th century. It is the territory of Huichin, which is the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. The land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people, who remain flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area community today. In my talk today, we are living through an unprecedented acceleration of climate crisis events that has transformed our priorities in our scholarship, our teaching, and engagement with each other. The panel titled Aesthetic Responses to Environmental Emergencies, Creating New Forms of Collaborative Art and Media Practices focuses on collaborative perspectives on film, web-based media, and art that engages the reality and severity of the climate crisis in an array of fast-changing environments. It explores work from experimental feminist, indigenous, and transnational cinema, performance, and installation art. The panel brings together two pairs of scholars who have worked collaboratively together for years. May Joseph at the Pratt Institute in New York City and Sofia Varino at the University of Potsdam in Berlin collaborate as two members of the Harmattan Theater Company, a New York City-based environmental performance ensemble applying theory in the environmental humanities to site-specific performances engaging oceans and islands. Drawing on histories of Venetian navigation and lagoon culture, Joseph and Varino propose a comparative lagoon aesthetics, one that would link the two archipelago regions, the Venetian lagoon and the extended archipelago region of Lakshadweep Sea of India. Drawing on the Venetian Camaldolese monk and cartographer Frau Mauro's Mappa Mundi, map of the 15th century, their work initiates a comparative dialogue between North-South island ecologies, seafaring histories, and open futures. Some of their recent collaborative research appears in a recent 2021 article in the well-known international journal Shima, titled Multi-Directional Thesology, Comparative Ecologies Between the Venetian Lagoon and the Indian Ocean. Okay. May Joseph, the first speaker, explores collaborative ocean experiments with Dalit performers along the Malabar coast in her paper titled Dalit Trance and Possession Techniques as Sea Methodologies, a Collaborative Approach. In 2011, she collaborated with a group of Dalit performers from the Theyyam and Kalipayattu performance traditions to delve into the history and ecology of the Fort Cochin shoreline in Kerala, India. It was a transformative durational performance in Cochin called, quote, When the Sea Rises, staged on the 16th century seawall of Fort Cochin, addressing mythologies and stories of the non-human and other than human ontologies. She will present a PowerPoint on the interweaving of divine modalities with ecologies of the non-human, where she unpacks the precarity of Dalit embodied histories of those who had been considered less than human alongside the endangered forces of the non-human along the Kerala coast. The second paper by Sofia Varino, titled Water Activity, Non-Human Collaborations with the Venetian Lagoon, explores transmarine immersive pedagogies in the Venice Lagoon. Approaching the phenomena of acqua alta, seasonal flooding in Venice, in the context of climate change requires collaborative modalities of thought and action. In this presentation, she deploys Harmington's Acqua Alta performance in 2014 and their postponed 2020 Venice project as a case study to consider how the medium of site-specific performance enables both performers and audiences to participate in a multi-species practice of collaboration in public space, activating bodies in real time in relation to the materiality of climate change events and the volatile agency of water. Whereas Joseph and Varino work on lagoons and oceans affected by climate change and rising sea levels, I and Ellen L. Glasberg, who present after me, work on issues of climate change and ice in the Arctic and Antarctic. We have been collaborating together since 2008 when we organized with Laura Kay an international conference at Barnard University and co-edited jointly an online journal issue of The Scholar and the Feminist on climate change, gender, and the polar regions. Our more recent articles on feminism, colonialism, art, and ecology include a 2012 article titled Disappearing Ice and Missing Data, Visual Culture of the Polar Regions and Global Warming, that appeared in a book titled Far Field, Digital Culture, Climate Change, and the Poles, edited by Jane Marshing and Andrea Poli. Our presentations today present more recent work from our continuing collaboration that appears in my forthcoming book, titled Climate Change and the New Polar Aesthetics, Artists Reimagine the Arctic and Antarctic. L. Glasberg's paper, Ronnie Horn, Inner Geography and the Shifting Water of Iceland, is drawn from chapter 5 of that book and focuses on a long-term multimedia installation set in Iceland created by artist Ronnie Horn that entangles and enfolds viewers in an ecological web. Touching on Ronnie Horn's work from 1991 to 2007, Glasberg argues that Horn's work, though usually understood in the frame of abstraction, guides audiences to the more genuine attachments to material environments by involuting and entangling the organization of psychic, material, and political realms. The final paper is by myself. It's titled At Memory's Edge, Collaborative Perspectives on the Arctic in Environmental Cinema, and draws from chapter 3 of that book. It broadens the work on aesthetics to address how a collaborative web-based Arctic cinema addresses climate trauma in damaged ecologies. The paper draws on the writings of indigenous literary theorist Gerald Visner, who uses the term aesthetics of survivance to articulate the central place of creative storytelling in visual form in indigenous knowledge to address climate trauma. I will build on this tenet by investigating the documentary film on the Canadian Arctic titled Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, directed by Zacharias Kunik and Ian Marrow. Okay. May.
Thank you, Lisa. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to be here. And I'm really excited to be in this panel with collaborators who have been inquiring into the intersection of climate, indigeneity, and thinking about oceans for the last 2 decades. I'm going to present today on the intersection of performance with the methodology of sort of thinking through how to respond to climate. And I'd like to begin with a performance I created in 2011 in Cochin, India. And I want to begin with an invocation to the Lenape peoples on whose land I have grown consciousness and come of age intellectually. I live in New York City and have been shaped by the histories of the Lenape. And it really is the the hidden and forgotten histories of the ecology of the Lenape peoples that have made me more aware about the kind of questions I wanted to ask through theater. And in the last sort of 12 years, I've collaborated with my colleague Sofia Varino in creating these site-specific questions with oceans and islands and coastal regions around the world that have been either affected or destroyed by climate, but also where the repressed and forgotten voices of people who actually own those lands have now sort of come to a kind of an awareness that they should be heard again and disinterred. So I will begin with the video of When the Sea Rises, which I created in 2011 on Fort Cochin, on the wall of the fort that Vasco da Gama built. It was done by the Portuguese in the 1500s, but it is also the place where my family lives. So the question I wanted to bring to this performance was, you know, how do we as decolonized entities of the last, you know, 70 years in the case of India, but certainly in most countries in the world, we're still in a decolonial phase. How do we make work that opens up the question of landscape and climate? And let me show you a few clips and then I'll get in with the talk.
May, we are currently not seeing the video, but rather your PowerPoint. So we're just hearing the sound from the video.
Let me screen share. Technical issues, the video is not showing. Stop share. Thank you, Sophia. I think I will try it one more time, and then I will just stick with the slideshow. Can you see the screen? thing has to move out of here. So I'd like to start off with that performance where I worked with these. At the time, I was unaware of their caste politics because I grew up in secular India. What I didn't realize is collaborating with these group of performers that they were Dalit. And it was only after the performance that these performers who are incredibly trained said to me that this was a powerfully transformative experience for them. And the reason they could do it was because I was not Hindu. And that was for me a moment in 2011 of becoming suddenly conscious of a number of things. One was that that this whole realm of caste that Dipesh Chakraborty's new book on planetary consciousness really opens up. That the question of caste really structured the possibilities of embodiment and climate questions. And my challenge to these performers to take these traditions that they were trained in, that was temple based performances, and to take it out to a site that was grounded in the Anthropocene, in the history of colonization of the 16th and 15th centuries, and to ask questions about the ocean and about the non-human in ways that they were trained to do, but never physically allowed to do. And this was a radical thing for them. This was a radical experience. And it was a moment where this collaboration, which took 2 years, I trained with them, and then we together created this performance. But what came out of it was both a realization on their part that the built environment was the larger theater, that the non-human was the perfect place for their performative techniques, their traditions of trance and possession, which within the temple structure, as untouchables and Dalits, they were only allowed to inhabit. In the case of the trance performer with the red mask, he comes from the Theyyam tradition. And the Theyyam tradition, these untouchables were not allowed into Hindu temples except once a year, where they embody the spirit of the Brahmin god, and they're allowed into these spaces. And I didn't realize I was bringing all of this other baggage into our performance and our collaboration, where they actually colonize the space of the fort, of the sea, in ways that they are, in terms of the history of the caste system in India, not allowed permission to do. And as you can see from the film, the question was, what kind of choreography, what kinds of performative techniques can can we harness in the Kalaripayattu and Theyyam traditions to ask questions of the non-human in terms of pollution, of algae bloom, of the garbage and trash of the coastline, of the oil slicks of the Cochin Harbor, and of the history of colonization of the Dutch and the Portuguese on the fort of which they were performing, you know, and this was the challenge to them as a methodological tool, and that was the question with which they came to this performance. So I want to, for the remaining of this hour, just for my talk, just quickly share screen with my PowerPoint, and I will skim through what I have. So for me, the work of performance, can you see my screen? Can you see my screen? Hello? Hello?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, good. So, so for me, theater is a tool for asking questions about colonialism, about the histories of the past, about the Anthropocene. It is a series of embodied phenomenological tools through which we can get to histories of the indigenous and ecological past in ways that we've not fully explored. And this is a map I took at the tip of Cape of Good Hope that shows the blue line, the passage of Bartolomeu Dias, and the brown line, Vasco da Gama, ending in Cochin. And to me, these maps have been critical to my own performance work, of which the Dutch East India Company's legacies of over 600 entrepots, which are these white marks you see on this map, are the sites of the work that I have been doing, including in New Amsterdam. And this is the 2004 tsunami, which came to Cochin, which is why we did the performance at the site where the big wave from the tsunami came. So for me, performance is an absolutely critical way of engaging coastal peoples around the world. And this is a map of the monsoon cities of the world that will be some of the first cities to sink. As you can see, some of the major metropolitan regions of the globe, which lie in the southern hemisphere, and many of them are going to be low-lying and will be sinking, and some of them are like Jakarta. So for me, the coast of the Malabar is specifically, and I will run through these Dutch maps. These are Dutch maps, and these are also the coastline where my family lives, that is constantly washed away. And this is where the Dutch speak of in their diaries, Varkala, Kayankulam, which is where the Romans came and the Jews arrived in the 2nd century BC. This is the site of where my mother lives, but it's also where Marco Polo arrived in the 12th century. And this is the image of the site I grew up in, but is actually inside the fort of the Portuguese and Dutch fort of Tangasheri. So I draw on these roots, particularly this site of the fort of Tangasheri, where my great-great-great-grandmother came was brought as a slave on a Dutch ship from Batavia to Quailan. And so there are these personal stories and these ecological stories of this image of Edavapuri, which is the intersection of sea and land, these porousness of the Kerala coast, of Valikavu in Kollam, where you have the Arabian Sea and the interior beginning to get sort of really permeated up, and its precarity is so fragile, because the entire coast, which is filled with sacred spaces like this particular site, which is a very ancient site of many gods, Tirumallavaram, this is where people come to pray for their dead, but it's also a place that has been washed away by so many storms, as you can see from the very fragile trees. And so Virinjam is the other site, which is both religious, but now a major port. So it is at these sites that the question of, how do we bring, performance to engage with histories of colonialism, but then also to ask questions of the present. As you can see here, there's a petroleum and oil refinery right behind the sea god. And for me, this was a juxtaposition of both techniques of performances. For instance, as in the case of this image, that is the Kalaripayattu martial art form that came in the 17th century in protest against the colonial powers of Dutch and British, and harnessing these techniques to ask questions about the ocean. As you can see, it's a working coast with all sorts of tugboats and the Chinese fishing nets in the back, as well as oil refineries. So there's the pollution of the coastline of Kerala is concomitant with its working coastline as a fishing industry, where it's overfished and the fishing communities are very fragile and greatly under duress in terms of the economy of and a greatly acidifying and dwindling of fisheries and coastal supply. So so the performance of the god emerging from the sea and engaging with the non-human in purging the histories of the past, but also asking questions of the Anthropocene, of embedding the body through performance of the Dalit body, which is a body with such deep historical significance, where touch is so powerful and so volatile, because the Dalits are not allowed into most spaces of the Brahmin pantheon. And bringing the histories of the Dalit, which, by the way, I realize my own family is from, but from 2000 years, because we are Christians who were colonized much longer than Christians were in Europe, because Christianity came to the Malabar coast before it came to Europe, from because of the way in which the trade winds flow. So this image of the sea god asking questions of the ocean, but also asking for the accountability of the world was the idea of when the sea rises. Now, my colleague Sofia and I have been collaborating for many years, and I want to end my talk with a project we did together in 2012, where Sofia played Da Gama's daughter, and we presented this performance at the site in Lisbon, where Da Gama would have returned from Cochin with slaves and spices, and he would have disembarked between these two pillars, which are now completely buried in water. And Sofia created this performance with this extraordinary performer, dance choreographer, Diana Nips. And we asked questions of accountability, historical memory, and the histories of colonialism and its truth and reconciliation possibilities by our collaboration. Sort of what happens when someone from a colonial country like Portugal, in the case of Sofia, makes a performance with somebody like me, whose family has been destroyed by the history of the Portuguese encounter. And we made this project, and this is Sofia in her black outfit, and Diana, who's sort of embodying the history and the spirit of the Tagus River. And Sofia is the daughter of Da Gama, mourning the death of her father, who died in Cochin at the site where the performance was created. So this story of dialogic excavation of a history of the past, but also asking questions of both climate, but also the history of the Anthropocene. What sort of stories can we ask? And I end with images of what I've done here in the Rockaways, the lands of the Lenape peoples. Once again, Sofia is in this performance. I hope we have a picture of her. I'm sorry I don't, but I will end with a picture of Sofia on the Governor's Island project, which was also a project in 2017 on the land of the Lenape peoples, to ask the question, how do low-lying regions of the world engage with each other? How can we ask questions that are accountable to the world, by saying, you know, we low-lying regions of the world, we have much more in common with each other in the global south than we do with necessarily in inland cities? And how might we reach out and express our solidarities with other communities? There we see Sofia in this image in the sunglasses. This was a performance that Sofia and I created. It was over 100 people on Governor's Island in 2017, where over 5 major storms had destroyed the Caribbean and impacted the East Coast. And we created this performance on the new seawall of Governor's Island, which has been created by West 8, the architecture firm, and the stones were brought from Greece. The idea of this new kind of thinking is to create forms of landscaping around the world, around New York City, that is is low impact and has both design elements, but is also able to offer a wider range of climate adaptation mitigation efforts. Is that a 1 minute or is that a 0? Thank you very much, everyone. And I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you, May. That was a lot of wonderful material you went through and almost made it in time. So, so I will do my own screen sharing. Hope to be able to get to my presentation easily enough. You can see it, right? Yeah. All right, so I will be talking about water activity and already thinking about the discussion we can have together, since we are all working on water in various forms and formations. And I want to be thinking about these non-human collaborations that we, all four of us, have also been engaging in. And I'll be focusing on the Venetian Lagoon and our project from 2014, Aqua Alta. But first, I want to think a little bit about the theme of the conference, emergency. So this sense of the need for urgent interventions propelled by climate change and other eco crises around it. And in terms of emergence, perhaps we also need to think about submergence and the ways in which the disappearing, vanishing materiality of our daily lives is in contact with climate change, with what is happening to urban sites, to sites around the world, and how we might engage with this vanishing archive. Here I chose an image from Far Rockaway from 2015, and we have one of our permanent performers in the company, Nandini Sikand, and I think it's an image that really encapsulates the way that Harmattan tries to create performance in collaboration with sites. So we collaborate with water, and here we have the performer submerged or half submerged in water. So what we do in terms of these non-human collaborations at Harmattan is something that I like to think of as a multi-species praxis. And of course, when I joined the company, and this is the first performance I did with Harmattan Theater in 2010, when I joined the company, I wasn't thinking of it in this way. It's a thought process that I've engaged with May, and I'm thinking of species here with Felix Guattari and other eco thinkers. So species in terms of all categories of entities, including concepts, media, objects, substances. So not species in this kind of singularity of separate, discrete species that sometimes we think of. And water as a species, as a substance. So we engage with oceans, seas, rivers, lagoons, lakes, all kinds of bodies of water. And what we try to do is really collaborate with that body of water. Find ways to do that, from when we begin to devise a project, to the development, to the rehearsal, to the actual day or days of performance, and then how we document the project as well, and how we create videos and photography that we then keep as a kind of archive. We might think of it as a water archive or a climate ethnography that we are doing. And of course, we are especially concerned and thinking about rising sea level. So the ways that water is rising, and here we can think about flooding and sinking, of course, in the case of Venice, and already thinking about our discussion in terms of melting as well. And we are also concerned with pollution and the kinds of pollution that is visible or invisible. So underwater, seaside, riverside pollution, and the kind of pollution that kind of tends to accumulate in underused or overused or abandoned sites. And thinking about our work over the years, the other day I was thinking what we are really doing is engaging in a kind of becoming non-human when we perform in a project, and the kind of experience that we create for our audience as well. So this kind of relief of leaving behind this burden of human exceptionalism and inhabiting our bodies and letting our bodies extend themselves and expand into our surroundings. So not being quite certain of where the body begins and ends. So it's kind of a phenomenological exercise that we bring to our works. So thinking about the phenomenon of acqua alta, which is the name for the kind of seasonal flooding that happens in the Veneto region, and particularly the city of Venice is struck by it, and because of the rising levels of the Venetian lagoon. So of course, Venice has this status as an iconographic sinking city. And what happens during acqua alta, which tends to happen more and more frequently in Venice due to climate change, is that the city becomes a semi-aquatic environment. So here we have this picture that's actually from a project that documents times of acqua alta in Venice, and is trying to be an activist project as well. So campaigning so that Venice can still be a living city, not just a city that functions as a kind of monument or a tourist site, but a space where people can live. And here in this semi-aquatic environment in this picture, I was very struck by it, although the quality is not that great, that we have that major chain store behind it, this luxury of, I think it's Louis Vuitton or something. And that's quite absurd when you look at what's happening to the city and how people are, trying to walk through the flood. So this is a good example, I think, of this kind of vanishing archive, the ephemeral, this aesthetics of disappearance that we are trying to engage with at Harmaten through our performance work. And here is an image, so from the Acqua Alta performance at the Ponte del Diavolo in the island of Torcello. And I quite like this this image just to look at it and think a little bit. So this island, the island of Torcello, where we performed, has this bridge that is a structure from the Middle Ages, and is one of a few surviving ruins. In this case, it has been obviously maintained over the years and repaired, so it's still a functioning bridge. And the performance we did there, so it was 4 performers. I was one of them at the front, and the way in which we kind of intervene in this site makes me question what makes this a site where we want to do a performance. What is it about this particular site that turns it into a site we want to interact with, we want to intervene on? And thinking about the non-human actants that are present here, so to use Latour's quite useful term, I think. So we have the water as an element that is both volatile and passive. And we have the built environment as what allows us to transverse it. And I wonder in terms of the way that we do it, and my own memories of doing this walk through the bridge, the way that we do the slow walk that May has trained us in, this kind of slow walk really slows down time, but it also does something to your sense of space, to what's happening around you. And you do notice your senses change because you're at a much slower pace, and you're able to engage with the environment around you in a very different way and really take in all these non-human actants around you. So the vegetation, the body of water, the bridge became kind of an uncanny structure that really seemed like it seems like a very futuristic kind of structure, but at the same time, you know its history, and you know it's something that has been there for such a long period of time. So in this performance, one of the things that interests me is to think about this kind of ecological attunement that performing in this way, in a site-specific way, enables. And so I'm thinking of ecological attunement as physical, affective, and cognitive. And there's a strong component of memory that is reenacted. And there's an attunement to the non-human capacity to act in what is around us, particularly water. So it's agency, it's subjectivity, but also it's passivity, as I said before. And this is a site that is also a public space, and that's quite important, that all the work that we do is done in public space that is accessible on principle to everyone. And so we have passersby, we have people who kind of don't really know what we are doing. Are we making a film? Are we doing a show? And that's quite important also because people can join in the performance if they want to. And so there's a kind of sense of opening up of the space that we are creating in this site, and an invitation to participate with us in the performance. And I think that bringing us into this sense, this very acute sense of real time that is kind of saturated with impressions of the surrounding environment and of our own embodiment, this very slow walk, allows us to just really pay attention and take in what's happening around us, and take in these kinds of the volatile elements around us as well. In this case, this performance took place in November, and we were very lucky with the weather. Of course, we were there trying to witness some aqua alta, but we didn't get to. At least I didn't. I think maybe you did, May. I'm not sure. But in other performances, the elements can be quite rough and demanding. So, you know, the wind, the heat, humidity, can all be quite challenging, particularly when you slow down. You don't go at your regular speed that you would kind of walk through wind or rain. So in terms of water activity, and this is an image from another performance that May directed, Cabo de Tormentoso, in 2011, I believe, in South Africa. Water activity really is something that in performance allows us to think about the sociality of non-human worlds. So to return to the question of the site and the site specificity of our work, it allows us to consider the sociality of spaces, and the sociality of what is considered to be outside of the human world. And because our work obviously engages with geography and geopolitics, I'm also thinking about Latour's ideas about becoming terrestrial. So kind of giving up on this planetary consciousness, but rather thinking of a much more flattened down to earth ecology that is much more about engaging with our lived environment in the moment, which is what I am calling a multi-species praxis in the way I described at the beginning. And this is what's bringing us to rethinking materiality in terms of thought and action. Am I getting a time signal? Okay, I can wrap up here and just you know, I look forward to discussing later on how we are thinking about these terms of, you know, the multi-species, the terrestrial sociality of non-human worlds. I think that can be a very productive conversation. And of course, we have to talk about water that we are all working with in different forms. So thank you very much. I think that's it. Very good. And I'll stop sharing. Okay.
All right, that was great, and I think there'll be a lot of building flows and interactions here. Let me share a screen. Uh, okay, I'm L. Glasberg, and I'm going to talk about Ronnie Horn's Vatnasafen, or the Library of Water, and I'll talk about focusing on her concept of inner geography. And I'm also, this is an exterior view of the Library of Water. It's in Stykkishólmur, a little town north of Reykjavik in Iceland. So, all right, and I'm hoping that I will be able to get thinking about her public art installation, the concept of radical relation, also her interest in anti-positivism in terms of phenomenology, but also history, data, and archives, and something that others have called fluid ontologies, meaning the flows between territory, identity, and how they interact with each other. And then I'm hoping I'll be able to make a move to thinking more fluidly about identity and perhaps migration with climate refugees in parentheses there. So, but mostly I'm going to get to all these things by thinking about Horn, who's not only a multimedia artist, visual artist, but also a very, very good writer and thinker, philosopher, really. Her concept of inner geography. And she also has an attendant koan that we should attend to the water in us. How do we recognize the water in us? So she's very interested in involuting humanist and materialist ontologies. And ultimately, well, perhaps we could, in a practical way, say she's considering how to live in a just way in relation to the earth, the past, and also the climate future. So it's a story of Ronnie Horn, the artist, who travels or migrates between Manhattan Island and Iceland, which is a more remote island nation. It's a story of geographical distance and connection. For Horn, moving across territory, I'm going to sort of click onto scenes of Stykkishólmur, what you can see from the library, which actually is a library that's been refunctioned by Horn in this town. So it's she's moving across territory, but also moving through geological, temporal, material frames. Iceland, which is her, in some ways, her great artistic project, her found object, but also her laboratory and her muse in a way. It's geologically young. Its foundations are actively geothermal, and Icelanders have had to become extraordinarily self-aware of the earth and the water under their feet and the crust. They're involuted with the material earth there. And in those involutions, I'm also going to, I hope, mix in language, the way that we express ourselves. So the Library of Water is a permanent installation for an ecosystem undergoing change at an alarmingly accelerating rate. It's a remodeled former library situated on a bluff in Stykkishólmur. Horn has displaced the dust motes of the library stacks with 24 floor-to-ceiling length tubes that encase the melted remains of an Icelandic glacier. And the main rooms, widened bay windows, which you can see here, look out onto the neighborhood and the surrounding waterways and islets. The Library of Water, or Vatnafen, includes a collection of local stories about weather, to which the public, the Icelandic public, is encouraged to add. And it also includes public rooms and an apartment for housing visiting writers. So language and writing and stories is very much a part of the installation. The tubes, you could say, are rooted down to floors, and they also shoot up to the ceilings. I have some images of that too, to this all the way up. They're sort of like light beams, and the pun there is intentional. They hold up the room, but they're also immaterial, they're light. That transmaterial pun is a typical move in Horn's work. So the premise here is to think about how do we recognize the water in us? How do we make the non-human human involutions and connections? And okay, so a tourist can visit Vatnafen because this is consciously a way for Iceland, which is very dependent on tourism as an industry, to enhance its international art presence. So most of the tourists arrive by jet, big carbon footprint, and they come to see the outdoors for the most part, but they also come to see art and visit Vatnafen. The visitors flow through the installation like water, which Horn has called a tolerant and a dependent element for its ability to dilute, mix, seep, or drown out. And it has an ability to accommodate infinite affordances for humans, but also for non-humans. The visitors see themselves reflected and distorted in this main exhibition, which is called Waters Selected. So I'm gonna just show you the way that, you know, the reflections and refractions work, and how you can, they're all my rather bad photographs, but I was there, and you can vaguely see, well, me, but other people as well, reflected. So these tubes of meltwater also reflect scientific ways of capturing data and information about the environment. They're like ice cores, which glaciologists study to find out about the history of, well, the elements. So I want to think about this term inner geography, that Horn has been developing this concept since about 1991. And I'll read out these things that she's written over the years. She says that these rarely experienced places, she's talking now about remote places like Iceland, but also within Iceland, there are many uninhabitable and uninhabited interior locations that she's talking about. These rarely experienced places are no less valuable than those we occupy daily, no less inhabited by us than our most familiar, intimate ones. In acknowledging them, we understand we are something more than the body we inhabit and the things we consume, and that we dwell in places beyond our immediate perception or reach, so that we may be beyond our sight. And here's the most important problem around this idea of inner geography. It's this link to actual places and to human bodies. It is common to believe that because we'll never travel to them, deserts, unoccupied places, their loss will have no effect on us, or that losing a place that is not occupied by humanity is a loss of no importance. And certainly the oceans and their vastness is also one of these kinds of places. That going from unseen to non-existent will make no difference. That's a problem. To undervalue these places, to allow them to be destroyed, is to live in a smaller and meaner world. And then Horn says, Ronnie Horn, wrote these thoughts prior to the building of Kerinjukar Dam. And that's a big deal in Iceland. It was a big ultra-modern project that basically flooded an interior region that was uninhabitable. And it's exactly, the logic was that, well, no one lives there and it doesn't matter. We'll just create this dam that will create power and money. And it was a huge international project. But this is something, the taking away of these places that are there, but we don't necessarily have to see, or touch. She says that this is a problem, that the future of ice, the future of whiteness, which is a weird word to use, but she uses it, and in a sense, the future of the idea of North, this remote North, it's all at stake caught up in this idea of inner geography that must be acknowledged in order for the world to be treated, I think, more justly. And she's worrying about too much development. So inner geography, I think, opens into the concepts of the non-human. It's no longer about the borders within the human, but about shared and entangled borders. Inner geography is a feeling for being there, but also not there, inside out, involutions. Interconnectedness is not only about the kind of infrastructural material connections, but as the new infrastructuralists might put it, it's about the felt, the unseen, and the unseeable emergent elements. So this is really about the material unconscious. And so that's where I'm hoping I can make a connection to the problem of human identity, right? She wants, I mean, as we go through and we see ourselves reflected and caught up in this web of interconnections that is the installation of Vatnafen. Horn wants people to be uncannily displaced and messed up, but she also wants them to think more carefully about their connection to the weather, to water, to the non-human. So you can see that this non-humanness even turns into just plain light, and even the refraction and the particles of light ultimately.
3 minutes, Elena.
All right, so I'm going to make this possibly impossible move to thinking about identity and some other aspects of Ronnie Horn's work. So that's a picture of Ronnie Horn from W magazine from, I don't know, 2007, maybe 2010. She's on the balcony of her Chelsea workshop. And as you can see, Ronnie Horn is a very specific, has a specific identity, and she is not, and she's messing with it, right? She's a what we call a butch lesbian, and her masculinity and her female body are being invoked in some very complex, amusing ways here. Here's some other of her photography, and her, I want to consider this a self-portrait. Other writers have backed me up on this, that in a way, Horn is projecting herself and connecting to the non-human world, in particular birds here. And you can see this is called Bird, or labeled under Bird in one of her books, though the pictures themselves are not called Bird. So she has a funny way of categorizing that. She's making a joke here. And she's also turning from the camera as the bird faces are turned away. And we have to study the details and try to connect with this distant yet close and maybe even internalized non-human other. So I want to also, 1 minute. Okay, I want to also suggest that this is a self-portrait as well. It's a drawing, and you can see the drawing is very abstract. That's another aspect of Horn's work, but it's also very material. This is made of pigment, red pigment paint, and varnished over, and it's just arrows lacking the tail, so that what you have really is what I call a clitoral, or making a joke about clitoris and the littoral, or the edges, and the that of both connections and disconnections, and scattered, seemingly random, but this is Horn's way of presenting herself, of understanding herself in a disaggregated non-human form, I would say. And then I guess my last move that I'm not going to be able to make very well, there's another wonderful butch who I love, Amy Ray, half of the Indigo Girls, who has a song, Birds of a Feather, in which she asks, why can't we just migrate? Why can't we just move? And that has been in the condition of humans for the longest time, before settlement erupted and took over the world, and actually possibly causes a lot of the political problems we have, and even the problems of knowing ourselves. Birds migrate. It's not an easy world for them. They react to seasons and to climate. We're now being asked in some ways, can we move? Can we migrate as a way to also connect to each other better, as Amy Ray is trying to get us to think about? I don't know if that all works, but I think it'll connect in ways with what everyone else has to say today. Thank you.
Hello. I sort of in my talk today titled, well, I first want to thank Elle and all the panelists. I mean, this is an amazing panel, and I hope this resonates with, I think, especially May's work, but everyone else's as well. This talk is titled At Memory's Edge, Filming Collaborative Perspectives on the Environment in Arctic Cinema. Here, I brought in the work done on memory and its aesthetics to address what it means to ethically witness the accelerating social and ecological impacts in a warming Arctic through a cultural inquiry into these issues without, importantly, sentimentalizing or spectacularizing suffering. This paper is taken from my new forthcoming book from Duke University Press that I mentioned earlier, titled Climate Change and the New Polar Aesthetics, Artists Reimagine the Arctic and Antarctic. The book presents art, film, and web-based media practices that address climate change, science, the non-human, climate violence, extractivism, and indigenous survival in the Arctic. It focuses on feminist, queer, post-colonial, and activist artists, as well as Inuit filmmakers and artists who inhabit parts of the circumpolar north. The work builds on my research from my first book, Gender on Ice that I did many years ago, a special issue that I did with Elena Glasberg on climate change, art, and the polar regions for the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and subsequent articles, including this one I did with Elle Glasberg in 1992 called Disappearing Ice and Missing Data. And then a piece in Arctic Archives, and then a more recent book that might interest everyone. It's just came out a couple of months ago, and it's called The Routledge Companion to Contemporary Art, Visual Culture, and Climate Change. For the purposes of this book, of this brief talk, I focused on a documentary by Zacharias Kunuk and Ian Mauro titled Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, that puts front and center communities from the circumpolar north that are often discounted cultures possessing environmental practices and concerns of their own. It also puts into focus what Anishinaabe cultural theorist Gerald Visner calls, quote unquote, an aesthetics of survivance. Survivance is a critical term in Native American studies that refers to an insistence on the ongoing nature of active survival, in which Native American peoples go beyond merely subsisting in the ruins of tribal culture after ethnic genocide to actively refashion memory for the contemporary era. Though the term aesthetics of survivance was not first defined to respond to the climate crisis, it can be used to articulate the central place of creative storytelling in visual form in indigenous knowledge to address climate trauma. The film addressed in this talk explores the mix of private and public histories and memories of its subjects in order to keep alive the memory of Inuit people that no longer feel at home in the Arctic in the way they once were. In the context of the paper, traumatic experiences are represented through a more accessible documentary web-based form. The film Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change is a collaboration between, as I said, Zacharias Kunuk, who's an internationally known Canadian Inuit filmmaker and director. He's known for making the film The Fast Runner, and has been well known for decades of work in both Canadian television and film. Ian Mauro is a well-known white Canadian geographer and filmmaker with expertise on climate-related issues. And finally, the third collaborator is Norman Cohn, a film producer who co-founded the first Inuit-owned production company. Here's a sense of the credits to the film, just to give you an idea. The film is the first to ask Inuit elders to describe the environmental changes in the Arctic they are experiencing in their own Inuktitut language. It's an important work that engages climate in ways that deepen our geographic understanding of adaptation and resistance from indigenous perspectives. The film works at the intersection of aesthetics and politics and is part of a growing genre of documentaries that highlight the firsthand experiences of those most impacted by climate disruption. The documentary is made for both a local and international audience, and as I said, and is readily available over the internet. Asuma TV takes the Akuma, the women's seal oil lamp that you can see in this image, as its iconic trademark, to underline also the central role that Inuit women play in their visual productions. The film focuses on the Inuits' own intimate experience of living on the ice in Igloolik, Igloolik, a semi-autonomous territory of Nunavut that covers large areas of the northwestern Canadian Arctic and subarctic mainland, and is both a testimony and eyewitness account about what it means to live in environmental conditions being increasingly and gradually degraded. The film largely dispenses with the filmmaker's voiceover and instead allows both its participants to speak without intrusions, to allow the focus to be on their intimate thoughts as they record their everyday lived experiences in their local communities. The film begins with an observation of one of the elders, quote, today it is impossible to correctly predict weather. by observing the sky, weather was predicted, cloud formations indicated wind directions. Now it is different. There is an ongoing deep concern expressed throughout the film in different ways. Notice how the sea is thinning, the ice, it's a reality for us. It's not here, it's here every year now. And we know, Inuit know we must adapt. So the film voices the sense of disorientation the community is feeling and living through now as climates and atmospheres, formerly important points of organization in their life, are rapidly changing as a consequence of severe global warming. The film, though it was made in 2010, remains important in that it challenges the way we perceive human interactions with the natural environment and the way it privileges other ways of seeing and knowing besides the scientific. Part of the challenge of the film for international audiences is finding out how important these other perspectives are, and the ways in which Western ways of knowing and seeing do not often include traditional subsistence knowledge important to the Inuit, but often dismissed in global capitalism as no longer relevant. The challenges the Inuit face from climate change related losses is seen as part of a larger decolonizing project as articulated by Kunik and others that emphasize the importance of maintaining Inuit cultural traditions and histories. One of the most salient features of the film is how it is shot from a perspective that presents the climate and the landscape through the perspective of native ancestral traditions of hunting, observation of nature, and oral traditions. Such a perspective is discussed as a long historical tradition of observing the environment closely as a necessary skill for surviving off the land through hunting and fishing. This is a system called IQ and is well known to the Inuit audiences of the film since the principles of IQ are integrated into its making. The film indeed regards the land not as a landscape, but as an environment. Here, IQ is seen as a whole other system of knowing, feeling, and listening. Such an approach incorporates the auditory and the haptic that brings the human and the non-human world together in a pan-Arctic world of places and species. Images in this film are populated with birds, seals, and polar bears to dramatize the importance of biodiversity of the ecosystem for the Inuit. It provides a distinctly different perspective at odds with older notions of pristine landscape used historically by conservationists to dispossess indigenous peoples of their rights to hunt on such land. Kunik and Mauro's documentary demonstrates that by transmitting traditional Inuit knowledge from one generation to the next and keeping alive a memory of cultural practices from a functional past, web-based media provides an important role in transmitting such vital knowledge between different knowledge systems and across languages. Significantly, many of the interviewees do not see themselves as climate or environmental victims with all the passive and depoliticizing connotation this term implies, choosing instead to see themselves as historical survivors of colonization, which allows for a sense of political agency. It is not by chance that Sheila Watt Cloutier, a Canadian Inuit activist who was also a nominee for the Nobel Peace Prize, and as of 2006, former international chair for Inuit Circumpolar Council, and Mary Simon, also formerly Canada's first ambassador for circumpolar affairs and lead negotiator for the Arctic Council, are featured in this film. Watt Cloutier describes at length how the severe environmental neglect and damage from extreme industrialization are among one of the lasting legacies of colonialism. She further explains how this was exacerbated by long-lasting organic pollutants, POPs, that many of them woke up to, and mercury traveling long distances to poison traditional food eaten raw in her community, such as meat and blubber from seals and whales that contain high concentrations of pesticides and industrial pollutants. this condition in which people living in the Arctic are the most contaminated, despite the fact that they live far away from these sources of pollutants, is a condition known as, quote unquote, the Arctic paradox. Watt Cloutier specifically found that the high POPs and mercury level in native mothers' breast milk cause irreversible neurological damages to fetuses. For Simon and Watt Cloutier, an indigenous future cannot be brought back in any straightforward, and this is Mary Simon. As for Mary and Simon and Sheila Watt Cloutier, an indigenous future cannot be brought back in any straightforward manner under the current conditions until global carbon emissions and pollution from afar are radically reduced. To bring this about, they turned to activism. Watt Cloutier, as I said, is a spokesperson for Arctic indigenous peoples in the negotiation also of the Stockholm Convention banning the manufacture and use of POPs, including DDT. More recently, she was the first to articulate the environmental and climate change as a human rights issue when she launched the world's first international legal action on climate change, a petition along with 62 Inuit hunters and elders, from communities across Canada and Alaska. Is that 5 minutes, Elle? 1 minute, okay. So let me end. I wasn't expecting it to end so quickly. So overall, the film reveals new perspectives from filmmakers who are making connections between indigenous histories, representational practices, and the growing environmental and climate threats in the modern Arctic. The film is also especially important in reflecting back on memory in terms of how its community is both at the forefront of present climate change and as historical survivors of dispossession and disaster caused by colonialism. In dark times, such a work conjures both the hope and difficulty of how film can be used for thinking not only about climate and environmental breakdown, but also activism and how its impact on cultural memory can contribute to cross-cultural solidarity and to the creation of new forms of local and international communities. Thank you. Okay. So anyway, in terms of how to sort of start with the question period, I'm going to ask May has some questions to ask us, and then I think as does Elle Glasberg. So perhaps let's start with May's questions.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And first of all, just really a panel that just really thought-provoking, and I've been taking notes, but I'm not going to look at the notes, but questions of historicity, methodology, form, all of these are kind of coming to my mind. So just synthesizing the three presentations of yours, what comes to the fore for me is there seems to be this interconnection between form and climate emergencies. And I'm using that word, climate emergency, more you drawing from your work, Lisa, and from Elle's. But I would say that what Sofia has broadly pointed out is this kind of deeper planetary inquiry that we are all of us engaged with. And my question is, what are some of these new forms we're playing with? What are some of these new pedagogies? I mean, for me, all of this is pedagogical. My theater practice, my engagement with Sofia's work, and my teaching. I teach a course, where people walk across the islands of New York, 15 of them in a semester. It's part of the performative pedagogical inquiry. So my question is, what are some of those intersections of a collective approach, the co-authoring that climate change and art is raising for you all?
Well, I can speak to sort of my book project that I did along with Elle, and my notion of devising a new polar aesthetics was meant to also challenge the dominant narratives of mainstream media that equates climate change with apocalyptic spectacles of melting ice and desperate polar bears. and also green capitalism with masculinist imagery of sublime wilderness and imperial heroics. Imperial heroics was the subject of my first book, Gender on Ice. So I saw this new aesthetics as bringing together more capacious aspects of the crisis through visual arts, photography, film, and I would say, and I thought such an approach focusing on aesthetics makes more legible and politically urgent and brings new relevant resources to the study of climate change in art history, visual culture, and the environmental humanities. But, I draw in my work also, besides documentary, also science fiction and, speculative futures in order to sort of think this through. So I don't privilege any one aesthetic form, but I just feel as a these new aesthetics dealing with the climate crisis that both you and Sofia are working on are incredibly important because they just bring so much more into the conversation. They connect debates on science and the environment with gender, race, colonialism, the relations of the human to the non-human. And I think this is what for me is crucial. Unmute. Elena.
I could just quickly add, in terms of form and climate emergency, that Ronnie Horn is, of course, a sculptor and extends this idea of sculpting, that everything is sculpting, intersculpting, right? It's sculpting, is about these involutions, and that the inside and the outside, and what's being sculpted, what's being formed by what, becomes a big question. And it's that also connected to a little point I left out of my talk, which was extinction. That's something that that Horn is getting us to think about. I mean, Vatnafen is, you could say, a glacier graveyard, and you go in there, and it's kind of playful and it's kind of lovely and austere, but it's also like the kind of romantic feeling you get from wandering through a graveyard, right? Which is very historical, and she's refunctioning that in a certain way. And you're being sculpted into this, and have then to think about identity, our relation to, these hyper objects of history and of extinction and of species, right? So that's why I made the move to thinking about very specific identity of the butch that Horn is part of, Amy Ray is part of, I'm also part of, but that is also maybe not forever, right? It came up, it emerged at a certain point, and just like with birds, species extinction is connected to territory. When cities are no longer hospitable or necessary for certain gay identities, we all know about gentrification, and the internet has made it okay to be gay everywhere, or not okay. What's happening to the butch? Possibly going extinct, or you migrate, right? And you migrate into something else, and that is happening too. I think that those are some things that feel, I don't know, productive, or maybe like okay, though we're still under the huge sign of doom and extinction that we are causing or not causing. It doesn't matter. It's happening.
Yeah, and to that point, I would say that, living in this constant state of anticipation, I quite like this concept from Anne Kaplan of pre-traumatic stress disorder, right? Like this state that we are living in, and how can we respond to that? And I think there's a pedagogical aspect, and also perhaps a therapeutic aspect to this kind of experimental form and aesthetics that we are working with, all of us. It's possibly a way to intervene, possibly a way to respond that can be healing to some extent for ourselves, for the environment. So that's the more hopeful note. But this constant state of anticipation, this futurity, thinking about our own extinction, thinking about the extinction of all these concepts and practices that to some extent we take for granted, that shape our daily lives. there's a definite sense of decay and of everything feels very, very ephemeral. And I think that's partly why we use performance in our work, May, because the sites that we are interacting with are kind of vanishing, disappearing every day. And performance is a way to just show up, just do our work and kind of let it go. So there's no permanence to performance, although we create this documentation, this archive, but we also let it disappear to some extent. Yeah.
That's really, really fascinating. And I would just say that one of the tensions, I think, with Anthropocene studies and climate studies is that there are the indigenous and native and aboriginal and first peoples of the world, like the Dalits, who are still waiting to emerge, who are waiting for citizenship, waiting for, you know, a return of their land. So there is this tension between language of extinction and the language of emergence that I became very conscious when I produced that performance, because they said to me, they were the non-humans in the history of India. It wasn't the sea. The sea had a lot more space in Hindu pantheology, in the Hindu, ontology, shall we say, in the belief systems, as opposed to the Dalits who are not allowed in. So it was very interesting for me to suddenly realize that there was this category of what they call as subhumans in this pantheon of non-humans. So I think there are these tensions, depending on where we are in the world, asking the question about climate or Anthropocene, that then runs into perhaps indigenous forms of emergence or subhuman and non-human forms, which is where humans were considered non-human in many parts of the world, including South Africa. So I ran into that when we put the body in the site, on the site. So there is that materiality of the multiple species conversation. We call the multi-species conversation bad, where the human is the non-human. And the sea or the tree or the forest has always been embodied in many ways, given spirit and form in a way that the Dalits have not. So it's a very interesting confusion of categories that I ran into because of our experiments with performance. So I think there's that power of the materiality of the body still, as opposed to the Ronnie Horn gorgeousness of the light on glass, which is utterly stunning, and glacial, you know, ephemera. I think that's amazing work.
So maybe we should end here, I think, or Elle, you had another question about site. I haven't been keeping track of the time, so do we know when we started?
We started at 11:40, so we're now at 12. So
It says
90
minutes.
What does that add to it? No.
It says 108.
Oh yes, that's what I meant. Yes. We started at 11:40, it's now 1:08. I just couldn't read time anymore. So I think we have 2 minutes.
Okay. May, could you sum up? I think I loved ending with what you just said, because I feel you put your finger on something really important on the sort of, the extinction in the context of, people who are just emerging. And I felt like that is something really significant. And if you had any final words, you or anyone else. We can't hear you.
In the history of, I think, climate theory, as Dipesh Chakrabarty's 2021 book says, the challenge between the science of climate, the geology of climate, but then the ontology of climate, which is human speaking and believing and inventing new forms. I think we're going to run into these irreverent tensions of emergence and extinction simultaneously. So that's where I would like to say the artwork comes in, and maybe hand over to Sofia for a minute, just to close that idea.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to be able to hold these two together, and to consider also how natural resources in many parts of the world are given political rights and are given political agency and how so many people do not have those rights, do not have that agency. And we have to be able to think about that also in relation to impending extinction that is already happening for so many quote unquote species. So to be able to think about all these things together, I guess is the challenge. And then I don't even think of it as a challenge anymore, but something quite impossible to be able to act, to be able to do something about it. It seems like a real impossibility, but we keep trying, I guess.
Perhaps, Elle, you could end on that note of the glaciers, because I just thought Ronnie Horn's work is very optimistic.
Well, don't forget the glaciers that are captured and contained and are threatening to flood are many of them since 2007, when she first installed it, are gone. So, and she knew this. That's why I focused on her writing and her concepts of inner geography, to say the least. She's thinking ahead, because she's thinking beyond the time frame of a human life or of human history, and outside those edges. She's becoming bird, she's becoming water, and glacier is becoming water. So she's very much thinking about a kind of extinction that has no political boundaries, but that also can be considered quite politically in terms of the fights in Iceland about dams and around the world, the kinds of identities and people, subspecies, if we want to say, that are coming into being and have never perhaps even had a chance to come into being, but must still be there in the unconscious in order for us to actually continue to have a world. That's also the necessary impossible, the real imagined, the unconscious.
So
the material unconscious.
So should we just end here and stop recording? And
Bravo, everyone. It was fantastic to be with you all. It was so beautiful.
Yes.